And I use the same diagram as I did for master slave. So for the circuit.net zone, server 1 was the master, or is the master, and server 2 is a slave, with the IPs as shown here. And now for another zone, college.net, the first server will still act as a master, second server will act as what's called a forwarder. So what's the difference between a forwarder and a slave? There are some important differences there. Okay, let me make sure everybody's following. No issues with microphone or screen sharing, everything is okay. So now we're focusing on a forwarder, then I want the server to be, second server to be a forwarder for the zone college.net. So, unlike a slave, a forwarder does not download a file from a master. In fact, there is no zone transfer in the case of a forwarder. See, I'm not showing anything there going on as zone transfer. So, very simple. The forwarder does not even have a file for the zone. What it does, it simply receives a request from a client pointing to it and redirects the request to the master. It simply acts as a pointer. The client points to the forwarder. The client by itself doesn't know about the master. It doesn't know where the master is. So the client is set up to point to the forwarder as being its DNS server. So when a client asks about college.net, then the forwarder server simply redirects the request, forwards the request to the master, and the answer comes from the master. So the forwarder is simply acting as a go-between here, between a client and a master. It will not have an actual file for college.net. Do you see the idea? So how does this compare now to slave then in terms of efficiency, or is it good or bad compared to a slave? Well, there is room for both, otherwise we'll be talking about them, right? There are situations where you might prefer slave, and other scenarios where forwarder would be better. So let's compare. From a point of view of redundancy, if redundancy is your main priority, then you should go for a slave server, because the forwarder cannot help in terms of redundancy. It does have a copy of the file. So if the master becomes unavailable, then the forwarder cannot help, because it simply points to the master. If the master does not respond, the client will not get anything for college.net. Right? So I repeat then, if redundancy is what you're interested in the most, then don't use a forwarder, use a slave server. Now when it comes to load balancing, which one is better? Here is where discussion gets a little bit more subtle. Because at first glance you might say, even for load balancing, the slave is better. Because once it downloads the file from the master, then it's independent when there are no updates. And therefore, the client that points to slave, the traffic is only on the slave. While the client that points to the master, the traffic is only on master. But in the case of a forwarder, when a client that points to the forwarder asks for college.net, it will still redirect the traffic to the master. So it sounds like when you use a forwarder, the master will still be getting lots of traffic, indirectly. However, the forwarder is providing a relief from zone transfer. The zone transfer itself is a burden because it creates network traffic. Of course, we're using small zones with a few records, but in real life, a DNS zone might have lots of records. It could be a big file. So doing a zone transfer, that operation itself creates network traffic. So now the question is then, which of the two is more of a burden? The zone transfer traffic or clients that point to the forwarder occasionally adding some traffic to the master indirectly? So it depends on the particular network and how it's running. See, if the master doesn't need editing its file often, if let's say you create a master zone file and you don't need to update it for 6 months, then once the slave gets a zone transfer, then there are no more updates to be done for the next 6 months there. That's it. There's no more zone transfer traffic. And that's it. In that case, the slave will be better than the forwarder even for load balancing. But it's a very dynamic network where the master zone file will be updated often, and therefore you often need to redo the zone transfer. And that could create lots of zone transfer traffic. And you might end up, realizing that it's better to use a forwarder, even though indirectly it will add some client request traffic to the master. But that could be less of a burden than constantly updating the slave with zone transfers. So it's really case by case. There could be cases where a forwarder could be more efficient than slave, and there could be other cases where a slave could be more efficient than a forwarder. So there's room for both depending on specific network situations. But I repeat, one thing is really black and white clear, that if redundancy is your priority, then you go with a slave. If load balancing is more of a priority, then depending on the specific network conditions, one or the other may be preferred. So before I show how to configure it, are there any questions on this discussion? Okay, I don't see any questions, so we can go ahead and configure it. So to configure a forwarder is pretty straightforward actually. Since there is no zone transfer required, there is nothing to do on the master. See, college.net is one of my example. I'll first check the master there. Actually, it's college.org I have here. I'll update my diagram in a moment. It's college.org, not .net. And let me see, I have, okay, I'll check in a second, sorry, a moment there. So you see, there's nothing I have added there. There's no allow transfer anything. There's nothing to transfer. So nothing additional to do on the master, just your regular zone file. So let's go on a second server. Which you like as a forwarder. and I'll check my name.conf file. In fact, here I put linksdrop.com as the one I want to forward to. So I may replace by college.org, no problem. And I'll update my diagram. So instead of college.net, I'm using college.org. So this is the zone I made last week as a new zone, right? College.org. So on the second server, if you like, as a forwarder, this is what we do. Zone name again, college.org, and type forward. You see that's yet another type. So type forward. And you see it will have no files for its zone. You just tap forwarders and the IP of the master server. And you close the bracket, of course. So this is the complete section. So basically, you just tell the second server where to forward the request coming from the client to this server having the IP 100.27. And it's type forward. Any questions on this? All right, so I'm going to change it. I changed the name of the zone. So I'll just restart a service. So how do we verify this now? There's no file to check. See, when you go to varnmd on the second server on the forwarder, it does not have any files with name college.org. Even if you check in slaves there, there's nothing. It doesn't get its own transfer. The file is on the master. Okay, so now we'll see how the clients will use this. And also let me show on the master what do I have as records in that zone, college.org. Here I have the file name.college.org. So that's it, I have a few records here. So I'll use an example here, hockey, that has the IP 60, and it has the alias FTP. So ftp.college.org, the alias ftp.college.org should resolve to 60. So I'll start with the client that points to the master. So I'll do ns lookup, ftp.college.org. ns lookup, sorry. Oh, I'm misspelling everything. It's college.org. I put extra C there. Clear the screen. That's better. So there we go. It resolves it to the right IP. This is coming directly from the master. This client points to the master. Now when I go to the Windows client that points to the forwarder, is pointing to the second server. So here, if I do DNS lookup, ftp.college.org, you see it's pointing to 100.2, which is the IP of the forwarder server. It gave the right IP. But look at the answer. Here it says non-authoritative answer. And that's exactly why. Because it's coming indirectly from the master. The server that I'm pointing to, which is 100.2, has no authority on this zone. It is simply redirecting requests to the master, and it's getting it from the master. So this is like the proof that you're getting this from a forwarder. See, for slave zones, there was nothing about non-authoritative. Because the slave server does have a copy of the zone. So when a client sends a request to a slave server, it is authoritative. It is using its own copy of the zone. But the forwarder does not have a copy of the zone file. It has no authority on this zone. It simply forwards the request to the master. All right, so any questions on this one? How to configure it, how to check it? Anything not clear? I'll pause a bit here. If you have any questions on forwarder, also compared to slave, you can ask questions on both. Now to help understand better, what I will do is the following. So as it is now, see, my second server is acting as a slave for soccer.net and as a forwarder for college.org, right? For both cases, the first server is the master. Now, on the client machine, I'll use the Windows client, which is pointing to the second server. So again, both are working, right? When I do DNS lookup smtp.soccer.net, this is coming from the slave zone. And when I do ftp.college.org, this comes from the forwarder operation. That's why it says non-authoritative. So both aspects are working right now. And now, what if I stop the service on the master? Let's say I'll go on the master server and stop the DNS service there. yeah, I made a change here, which was I changed from, I didn't change anything. Why am I asking me to more save changes? All right, I didn't change anything here, so I'll say no. So, yeah, I'll stop the service. So the master is no longer available now. See, this server is off for DNS, but the second server is still up and running. So what's going to happen now? And to make sure that no cached information will be used, I'll go on the second server and restart my DNS. And then on the client machine, I'll clear the cache. Oh, sorry, ipconfig. Clear screen. So ipconfig. So now I'll repeat those two ls-lookup commands. For the slave zone, smtp.circle.net, still works. Surprised? The master server is down. There is no DNS running on a master server. But the slave server doesn't need the master server. It has a copy of the zone. So it's using its own copy. I mean, it needs the master server only initially to get the zone transfer and later on to get updates. But as it is now, to answer the client's request, it does not need the master server. It uses its own copy of the file to answer the client's request. If I try ftp.college.org, see, it doesn't work. Why? Because this server by itself, the server acting as a forwarder, does not by itself have anything about college.org. It redirects the request to the master. And when the master doesn't have DNS running, when the master is down, the forwarder cannot help. All right, important to understand this. So I'll just tell the service again on the master. Now if I repeat this last DNS lookup, now it works because the master responded to the forwarder's request. Of course, the slave zone also works. The slave zone did not need anyway the master to be there because it's using its own copy. All right, time to see again if you have any questions on this subject. Master, slave, forwarder, any questions? So I don't see any questions. It's been a while now, so either it's very clear. I hope everybody's following, because if it's clear, great, I'm happy, but otherwise, if you need to ask questions, feel free to do so. All right, so I hope everything is clear. We'll move on. So the next thing I'd like to do, last week we covered some IPv6, right? I showed how to configure IPv6 on a Linux machine and we did ping between machines and so on. Here in this lecture notes, you also have a review on the basics of IPv6. I've been assuming that you have seen this before with Windows courses, but here you have a refresher. See, here's an example of v6 IP. The red part is the host ID, and then, I'm sorry, the red part is the network ID. And then in black, we have the host ID here. /64 means prefix 64, so it's the mask. The first 64 bits here are the net ID, and the last 64 bits are the host ID. Then here is an example of simplification with the zeros, and see how to simplify IPv6. So in the end, it simplifies to this form. So there are multiple fields of zeros. You may squeeze them into two consecutive columns. Here I have a field of 4 zeros. You can write only 1 0. And when there are leading zeros, you don't have to write them. Also to remind you that in IPv6, FF, whenever it starts with FF, the first two digits there, it's a multicast. When you have colon 1, that's a loopback. And if you just put two colons, it's an invalid IP because it would mean only zeros. You can assign this to a device. So on any machine having IPv6, you should be able to ping the loopback. Let's say I go on this one configured last week, so if I do ping 6 colon 1, do the same thing as pinging 127.0.0.1 in IPv4. It's a loopback. Then also, any questions so far? Here you have a review on link local auto configuration. See, when you do ipconfig or ifconfig, even though you configure your IPv6, it still shows you those link local IPs for auto configuration. Here's an example of it here. Although they are useless when you configure the IP, but still it shows link local. That's auto configuration. And just to know there, as part of the IPv6 knowledge, where it comes from. So you have the details in lecture notes. So a link local IP is identified by this pattern in binary. The first 10 bits are like this. 4 ones followed by 1110 and then 10. And this means the first two digits are always FE, like FE80 there. FE are the first two digits. Now, the third digit could be 8, but could also be 9A or B. Why? Because the only requirement is for it to start with 1, 0. And then the following two digits could be, two binary bits could be anything. So if it's 1000, that's 8. If it's 1001, it would be 9. If it's 1010, that's A. If it's 1011, that's B. Here are all the possibilities. So any of these could be a valid linked local IP. And the rest could be anything. So often when you do ifconfig or ipconfig, you see it as FE80 because it starts with the beginning of the range being 8. So FE80 here. So now I'm reviewing this today because you can also apply IPv6 in DNS and also talk about the host file in a moment there. So now that we have covered some DNS features, you can also include hostname to IPv6 resolution in DNS. And we'll look at an example of this right away. And I have it here actually. So forward lookup, it's AAAA records. So just as in IPv4 we have A records for resolving hostname to IP, when it comes to IPv6 it's referred to as AAAA records. We put 4 A's. The logic of this is that an IPv6 is made of 128 bits, and IPv4 is 32 bits, so ratio number of bits is 4. It's 4 times bigger. So they put 4 A's instead of 1 A. So it's an opportunity to ask any questions you might have on the basics of IPv6. Any questions? All right, then let's look at an example of applying this in IPv6 to DNS. It's important to practice this as well because later we'll do things like FTP sites or websites using IPv6 and they will need DNS resolution. So I'll go to my DNS server. I'll pick one of the zones. I have a few zones in which I have IPv6 records. So let me check sports.com. Oh, I mean etc, sorry. All right, in this one I don't have any IPv6, but I do have some in other zones. I check soccer.net. Here we go. So here's an example of an AAAA record. So I put store 6 as the host name in AAAA and the corresponding IPv6. Of course, this must be a valid IP available on one of the computers, or else it will be useless, right, as a record. So I'll show the IP in a moment. So you see, it's similar to an IPv4. So instead of A, you put AAAA, and you put corresponding IPv6. And you may also create aliases for it. I have it right underneath. So if FTP6 is an alias for store 6. So it means ftp6.soccer.net should result to this IPv6. So just look at these two lines. Is there anything not clear? Creating host record for IPv6 and also corresponding alias record. So how to check this? First, let me check if this IP is valid. On this server now, do I have an IP of this A6 colon 31? So I have config. I don't see it here, but I might have it on a different machine. So let me see, where is the IP A6 colon 31? Here we go. It's on this machine A6. So that record there I have in DNS is for this machine in IPv6 A6 colon 31. So it's available. So to check it, you check it the same way. NS lookup, or actually, I'll show it now. To check it from Linux CentOS client, I recommend using the host command. So I'll do host ftp6.soccer.net. Here we go, it gives corresponding IPv6. So use the host command on Linux, because if you use NS lookup for IPv6, it doesn't work in a straightforward way. You'll need to put some command options for it. But host is very straightforward. It's up to date. You just put host, the name that you're looking for, it gives you corresponding IPv6. Now, if you do it on a Windows client, I think I mistyped the password. All right. Now, what I'll do here, I'll point it back to the master here, because I'm no longer using the forwarder or slave zones there. Or maybe I am, soccer.net was a slave zone, no need to change here. So it should work. So I'll do NS lookup. So in Windows, NS lookup works no problem. For IPv6, can use NS lookup. So ftp6.soccer.net. It should get from slave zone. Here we go. Notice that to make use of IPv6 in DNS, you don't need to point to the DNS server itself in IPv6. I'm still pointing to the IPv4 of the DNS server, but that DNS server I'm pointing to has records in IPv6, so no problem, it gives me the answer. So in control panel or resolve.conf in Linux, I'm still pointing to the IPv4 of the DNS server. So I'll show you again the configuration if you have any questions there. Here are 2 lines. Now, in this module, we're not doing reverse lookup for IPv6. So don't worry about that for now, unless you have time and you want to, look out for it and how to do it. But in this module, it is not a requirement to do reverse lookup in IPv6. But in IPv4, yes, we did it before the break, right? But in IPv6, I'm talking about, we're doing for now only forward lookup. There's still no questions. I don't see any questions there. All right, so time to talk about first what to do in the lab time today, and also I'll have another thing to talk about just shortly afterwards. So going back to my lecture notes, the host file, if I don't have time today because getting late now in the lecture, tomorrow I'll also include the host file discussion. Tomorrow we're doing routing, but before that I will take a bit of time to deal with the host file and compare to DNS. You'll see exactly what I mean tomorrow. But now, time to send a research paper for this module. And I have it here. So I'd like to do a comparison between IPv6 and IPv4. And here are the criteria, comparison points. Now, actually here I put requirement that the paper has to be personal effort. Copy and paste. These are always regular things to be aware of. And this paper is due Friday, June 11th. I don't make it required for Monday because you don't need necessarily remote access for this, right? You can even do it outside or complete your work outside remote access hours. So you have until Friday next week to submit this. So important to note that you submit it to my email, right? It's written here. Don't send it to the same email as lab reports. Submit it to my email, which you see here. And make sure that you write your name and student ID on the paper, or else your paper could be discarded. So I put this in bold red characters. And honestly, I'm tired to deal with this because You cannot submit a paper to someone without writing your name and ID on the paper. And unfortunately, some students keep on doing that. Just because you're the one sending the email, it doesn't mean that's enough. When you submit a paper, the first thing is on the top of the paper or in the file name of the paper itself to write your name and student ID, or else I'm under no obligation of checking your paper. I'm not interested in receiving anonymous papers. It has to be properly identified. Clear enough? Now for the comparison point, actually I didn't write them here, but what would you compare when it comes to IPv6 and IPv4? Things like security, efficiency, performance. Also in its basic form, what are they? How many bits do they use? So make a full comparison, right? So I repeat, things like security, performance, how many IPs they provide, given a number of bits. Okay, so go into as many details as possible, just go online and find information. And what are their specific features? How do they compare? I gave you some hints here as well. You see, this is the way to identify multicast in IPv6. How would you identify multicast in IPv4? What's the loopback? So make all the important comparisons there. IPv6 is getting increasingly important. So that's why I'm doing this paper, to encourage you to read more about it, to find out more and learn about it. It is the future. Remember, this is worth 20%, so it has to be quality paper with lots of details. You just submit a short paper with a few paragraphs with some vague statements there. I cannot give you a good mark for it. It could be a poor result. So you need to put in some time and effort to find out and read about many aspects of comparing the two IP versions and writing about them. Any questions about this? Yes, a table will be fine. You can do a table, but again, the important thing is the information you put there, enough details. Okay. For the format, I'm very flexible. Just the content that counts, right? It could also be a combination of table and additional paragraphs you may write. So that could be part of your lab time today. You may start working on this paper, but also, of course, to practice everything we showed today, meaning assuming you have finished last week's work. So today what we covered as new material is reverse lookup that I demonstrated in the first part of the lecture today, and then master slave and forwarder. So all these things have to be practiced well. And also in the end, I showed how to create and check an IPv6 record for DNS. Now, even though right now I'm not asking a lab report on these things, please don't be short-sighted. There is a lab test in the end, and it is likely that any of these things could be part of a lab test later. If you don't practice it now, when are you going to practice it? Tomorrow we'll do routing. Next week we'll do other subjects. There's still a lot of things we're going to cover in this module. It's only week number 2. So today is the time to practice reverse lookup, master slave, forwarder, and also how to create and check an IPv6 host record in DNS. So if you followed the lecture, you took notes, so you know what to practice. I'll also give you this diagram as a reference. I'll put it in Teams a little bit later. Well, it will be hard to review the DNS setup in a few minutes. It's, of course, a detailed thing. You have the lecture notes from last week, and maybe also in the lab time you can get some help from the assistants, Ankit and Sahil. If you send me specific questions, I can answer. But to say in a few minutes to review the DNS setup, that will be basically repeating a lecture on DNS. It's hard to do in a few minutes. There's again something about let's see the issue on last week's lab. What's the issue? Let me try to read this. Because I need to check this with Ankit and Sahil to see if there was really a problem to justify to extend the lab time. We don't do that normally. Otherwise, if I were to say yes quickly like this to request to extend lab report time, it would become a habit, and that's the last thing I'm interested in. We do that in extreme rare cases where there was really a justification to extend the lab report time. If there was a problem, how come a majority did submit the lab report? I have to check this with Ankit and Sahil, so right now I cannot say anything about it. So before this lecture, no one brought to me anything about this. So for the other request again to cover the basics of DNS, look, all I can show right now is that it's in a few minutes. DNS is done by 2 steps on a DNS server. Here's my DNS server. So the first step is to go to etc and edit named.conf. But you have to get the right copy of named.conf, not the one which is by default in the etc folder. That's why there's in a class share, we have templates for it. So that's where you declare your zones. These are examples of it. And for every zone you declare here, you have to create a corresponding file in var named. So in var named, that's where I am right now. You have the corresponding zone files. In the zone files, you put the DNS records, such as insoccer.net. There are host records, CNAME records, SOA and NS records. And templates files are in the class share. So you go to DNS, and you have 3 templates there, one for nanny.conf, one for a zone file environment named D, and also for today's material, part of today's material, you have a template file for reverse lookup. So it's the best I can do right now to review quickly in a few minutes the basics. Otherwise, it's really details we have to get into. So if you have any specific questions, you may send questions. Because it may be that there was an error in the script. I'm not saying it's impossible, but the bottom line is that in the lecture last week, I gave a full demonstration of how to configure namely.com and how to use it. In my opinion, the problem is that some of you are not following the lecture well, are not taking notes. If you had followed the lecture well last week and taken notes of the syntax, you could have very easily fixed whatever mistakes might have been in the script. My demonstration last week was perfect. Everything was right in my file, and I showed every step of how to configure it, and I gave you plenty of chance to ask questions, like I did today. The question is, are you following the lecture properly and are you taking notes? That's where I think there's a weakness here. You see, today, there were very little questions, if any.
It was not because of that. I was just added to the class this week because
Just
of
write messages if you have any questions, okay? Is there other ways to set up DNS? Yes, there could be other ways, but if you want to find out other ways, you have to check online. This is the way I'm teaching it. This is the way we're doing it, okay? Again, the bottom line, I understand, I cannot perform magic here. If you missed the lecture for whatever reason, I'm not saying it's necessarily your fault. But what can we do now? I cannot repeat a lecture. You see, a few of you, I think, complained to administration that for whatever reason you did not receive the link last week. Although we had added people, all of you, into Teams, and Teams generates automatically an email that's sent to you when we had students there. But if you didn't receive the link, why didn't you contact me before last Saturday? Why did you wait until Monday to contact the registrar? I don't understand. I don't see that. You knew the course was to start on Saturday last week, right? If you did not receive the link before that, why didn't you contact the teacher, myself? There's only so much we can do, I mean. In some cases, I received the info from a registrar on Friday afternoon. Then I sent the link. I added the student to Teams here. Now, the other thing I'd like to mention here is that I'll post the marks. I'll do it right after the lecture there. I will post the marks of the previous module there, which is TBK. So you'll see it by your student ID and the final mark. Now, in general, I'd like to make it clear that generally speaking, the marks are accurate. And it's rare that there could be any issues there. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's very rare that marks need to be reviewed. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that do not just like that. Once you see your mark there, do not just like that, please send me a request saying, could you review my papers and my mark? I mean, don't say to yourself, let me try my luck. Maybe if I send a request to check it again, maybe somehow I will get more marks there. In general, that will not happen. It will be a waste of time for you and for me to send a request to review your mark just like that. But if you really think that there is a good reason that your mark might be wrong, then yes, you have the right to request review it. But I won't have time this weekend, unfortunately. I have a lot of other things to do. So if you do send me a request to review your mark, I will reply to you later during weekdays. I don't have time this weekend to get into that. All right, so please act in a reasonable way. I repeat, in general, there is no justification, just a request, just like that saying, please review my mark. But if you really think that something went wrong there, if you have very good reason to think that, then yes, you have the right to send me requests for that. So I'll post the marks after the lecture. Now for a computer number, I can assign a computer number to you. Well, actually, me personally, I thought, because when you communicated by email last week, I thought you already had a computer from another course. If not, I will assign one shortly, and I'll ask IT for you to have a computer in this room as well. So that could be done very easily, no problem. So what I'll ask you to do, please just send me a message in chat about this, and then once I get the number, I'll respond to you so that you can use your PC. All right, anything else in the next few minutes there? Any question about the course material we did today? All right, so tomorrow morning we'll finish just one more thing about DNS in relation to the host file, and then we'll start a new subject, which is routing. That's why it's important not to fall behind and practice today what we covered on reverse lookup, master slave, forwarder, and IPv6. And also, of course, I'll post a research paper. It's in the lecture notes, so you'll get research paper requirements shortly in Teams as well. All right, so if you don't have any questions now, I will do that. I will post the lecture notes and also the marks in a few minutes.